In my very early childhood, I had an extra set of grandparents. They were the neighbors of my biological grandparents. Their names were Virginia and Tish. And when I was about 3, Tish started to go blind. And over the course of 3 or 4 years, he was completely 100% unable to see. And when I think about that now as a grown woman, the idea of losing your sight as an adult and as an older adult is horrifying. I really can't think of anything off the top of my head that would terrify me more than getting that kind of a diagnosis. But from a 4-year-old perspective, when I was told about Tish's illness and I got an explanation of what was going to eventually happen, I wasn't afraid and I wasn't horrified and I didn't feel bad for Tish. Instead, what was happening to him seemed mysterious and in a way like an adventure, because I knew that Tish was going to have to figure out a new way to experience the world around him, and I tried to go on that adventure with him. I blindfolded myself in his living room and tried to figure out how he was going to find his way from one end of it to the other. I used my hands and tried to listen and feel shapes. And also, as he got gadgets to help him with his blindness, everyone that came into the house fascinated me more. He had a briefcase, and it had a lock, and instead of having a lock that you did with numbers, this lock was the wheels had made series of clicks. And to open the briefcase, you had to have the clicks work in just the right order with just the right sound. I played with that briefcase for hours, opening and shutting it. And I loved his cane with the red tip at the end. I loved watching him walk down the street using the bottom of the cane like a set of eyeballs. I also, by the time Tish was completely blind, had come up with a bunch of new games for us to play that weren't like the old games. But I liked them just as much, and I will tell you that from what I could tell, Tish liked them too. There was one that happened in the summer. He would sit out on his lawn chair in the yard, and I would take his wife Virginia's brass spray can that she used for her indoor houseplants, and I would take off my shoes, and I'd walk as quietly as I could up to Tish, sometimes behind him, sometimes right in front of him or to the side. And I would try to spray his toes with the spray can before he was able to know I was there. And then I'd get away as fast as I could before he could catch me. And again, I think we played this game for hours, and he laughed and I laughed. And I might be kidding myself, because I never got to know Tish as a grown-up myself. I think that when Tish and I were spending time together, he experienced his blindness the way I experienced it. That there was something mysterious about it, and there was really something of an adventure about it. And I think at least in those times when we were together, he was enjoying the adventure, perhaps not in the same way as I was, but nevertheless enjoying it. And I have the feeling that the reason he was able to do that was not only because he was being a kind guy who was grandparenting me. I think he knew that I had absolutely no fear of his blindness, and I didn't feel in the least way sorry for him. And I think because of that, he was whole when the two of us spent time together. The gospel story this morning opens with a man who has been lame for 38 years. That is a long time. And to the best of our knowledge, for every one of those years, that man has been sitting by this pool of Bethsaida, where legend has it, when the water bubbles, if you're the first one in, you can be made whole. You can be healed. And one day, like every single other day of the last 38 years perhaps, the man is sitting there again, and Jesus walks up to him and asks him what might seem like an obvious question, but he's been sitting there for so long, I wonder if he even remembers why he was there to begin with. Jesus asks, "Do you want to be made well?" The man does not answer the question. The man immediately goes to explain the reason why he cannot be made well. He says that he has no one to bring him down to the pool when it bubbles. And so every time it does, he's not able to be the first one there, and so he is unable to be made well. And so Jesus, out of nowhere, demands that the man get up and pick up his mat and walk. And Jesus being God, the man gets up, picks up his mat, and walks. We don't hear anything about his joy. We don't hear anything about him thanking Jesus. He just does what Jesus commands. And the lectionary this morning leaves off at a strange place. The last thing we heard this morning in the reading is that this miracle, this healing, happened on the Sabbath. And if you're not familiar with the text, you don't know that the very next thing that happens is that the vestry wardens and priests of the church, the leaders of the temple, approach this man and ask him what on earth he's doing working on the Sabbath. Because anything, including picking up a mat, is considered work. And not only is it unlawful, it's sinful to do any kind of manual labor on the Sabbath. The next thing that this formerly at least physically lame man says is, "It's not my fault that I'm carrying this mat and working on the Sabbath. I wouldn't be doing that if it weren't for that man. It's his fault. That man who healed me. Blame him." This guy's legs might be working and his body may be healed, but it sounds to me that he remains sick. spiritually ill, unwhole. And then, after 38 years, this man does something that nobody with a physical infirmity is allowed to do. He walks into the temple. If you are physically unwell, understanding in ancient Palestine is that you had some kind of spiritual illness as well, and that you were sinful, and so not being clean, you were not allowed to go into the temple. But this man was physically well, so in he walked, where Jesus sees him again. And as soon as Jesus sees him again, this man goes back to the church authorities and says, "There he goes. That's the man who healed me. Go get him." I don't know what you do when you pray, but I know that lots of times the reason that I pray is because there's an obstacle between me and whatever it is that I want. And sometimes I think of it as I'm over on this side of my life, there's a problem in the way, and I know what my life should be and what I want it to be. And so what I do is I ask Jesus to take that problem or person or illness out of the way so I can continue with the life that I know that I want. And so that kind of praying is less of a "thy will be done" and more of a "my will be done" kind of prayer. Conform to what I know that I need. I know what I need. I'm not asking for you to tell me what I need. Fix this thing and I will be fine without you again. So thank you, God. But I think that the gospel this morning shows me something about that kind of praying. It actually shows me two things. One is that Jesus himself can stand in front of you and heal you of your illness or fix your problem, and that doesn't necessarily fix your spiritual disability, which might be you think you're God. You're your own God. Or there's a problem. There's always going to be the next problem. Or if only this, and this would happen, then I could be or do the thing that I need. That might be a spiritual illness more than it is an actual reality. And also it's about your will being done, not God's will being done. So that's one thing that it points to. But then it also points to a deeper reality, which is that it is possible that you can be made well as long as you are available to the presence of Christ in your life no matter what. At the church I was serving before Grace, there was a couple who had been married for over 50 years named Alberta and John. And this church was a 100-seater, narrow little house on the prairie, white steepled kind of deal. And I'd been to Alberta and John's house, and they had a picture standing in front of it in something like 1960, because they'd been married at that church. And by the time I arrived, they were married for over 50 years. And when I met them, There's actually a whole row of people in that church that had been there for over 50 years. And you might not know it, but when there are elderly people in a congregation and a young priest comes in, not only are they looking at you like, oh, can you actually be my priest? I don't know. They give you that quizzical look. But I was keenly aware that the whole two back rows of this congregation, who had had the same seats since about 1960, were looking at me thinking, oh, yeah, she's the one that's going to bury me. Interesting. So I was being interviewed on that level, too. And they were right. I buried all of them. 6 years. But for a few years anyway, I got to see Alberta and John in action as a couple. And every day, every Sunday, they'd be there 10 minutes before 10. They would sit in their pew, and during communion, they would get up together. They would enter the row, the aisle. They would hold hands. They would walk up to the communion rail. As ancient as they were, they would kneel, and they would receive communion, just like they did on the day of their wedding. And this went on until just out of the blue, Alberta suddenly was struck with this virulent dementia. It happened in a matter of weeks, where she went from being as clear as a bell to just not even being able to put on her own clothes and not recognize John. So she wound up in a nursing home. And I'm sure you're not going to be surprised to hear that not long after that, because Alberta wasn't around to monitor what John was eating, his already pretty bad diabetes got dramatically worse. And he wound up hospitalized, and he wound up having his leg amputated. And so, one day, I went from church to go to the nursing home to commune Alberta, or at least try to commune Alberta. And after I finished up there, I drove to Morristown Memorial Hospital, trying to think of what I could say to John, who the week before had had his leg removed. What I could say to him about his wife, what I could say to him about the rest of his life, what I could say to him about this supposed loving God. And you might think that someplace in preschool there's a class on what to say to people who are going through unspeakable suffering. It's not. It does not exist. There is no such class. So I was trying to go through in my head between the nursing home and the hospital what exactly it was I had to say to this man who was 2 or 3 generations ahead of me, and had been through a kind of suffering that I just could pray. The only prayer I have about that is, please, God, never let that happen to me. That's the kind of prayer that I was doing in the car. And so, even as I'm walking up to the room, I'm trying to think of what I'm going to say. And even as I'm pulling up a chair next to John's bed, still don't know what to say. So I sit there and I'm quiet for a minute. And the best I can muster is, so, John, what have you been thinking about while you've been lying here in this bed for the last week? And John said, I have been thinking about how good God has been to me my entire life. I am the most blessed man in the world. Jesus doesn't promise that if you pray, and if you try to be a good person, and if you take care of other people, Jesus doesn't promise that even if you're a really good person, you're never going to suffer. I know you've seen enough good people suffering, and I've seen plenty. He doesn't promise that your life's going to be easy. I think what Jesus does promise is that if you are present to the possibility of Him being in your life, even in the middle of times of terrible suffering, He will make you well. The only question for us is when Jesus comes to us and asks us if we really want to be made well, will we be able to answer that question? And when He says, take up your mat and walk, will you follow Him? Amen.